Well, I hope we've enjoyed the last hour and a half or so, and it's back to business, I'm afraid. I'm going to hand back over to Donald Forsyth. He's going to move the report of the Board of Trustees, and then I hope that I'm guessing there's a seconder. So, Donald, please.
Moderator, thank you. I would just like to move the report.
Thank you. Okay, who is seconding? Gordon?
Gordon MacLeod, North Harris Free Church. Moderator, Fathers, Brethren. As Donald has outlined to us, we have an expansionist vision, and we seek to take the church forward. And obviously we require wisdom and grace as we move forward in the coming year. We're thankful to God for his provision for us over the past 2 years, which have not been without challenge. And as we take a step of faith with our Healthy Gospel Church vision, we recognise that going forward, with the rising cost of living, as this bites, it will impact our members, our adherents, and our congregations across Scotland. Andrew reminded us, as he came and spoke, about the Healthy Gospel Church, the need for us to commit everything to God in prayer. And while we come out of one challenge with COVID, and we move into a further challenge across our country, we do want to commit everything that we do to prayer. We've been very blessed in the church over the past 2 years. We've got a lot to be thankful for. We've heard very positive reports so far, and I'm sure the rest of the reports that we have before us will be just as positive as we seek to move the church forward. I commend this report to you, and I formally second the report that's been presented by Donald. Thank you.
Thank you. I understand there are 3 amendments, so I'm going to call for these now. The first one is from Benjamin Wilkes, please. Could you come up and present your amendment?
Moderator, Fathers and Brethren, I'd like to refer you to page 56 of the Assembly reports to item 5 under Legal and Compliance. As stated there, the Assembly previously asked the Board of Trustees to consider what financial support would be available to ministers facing legal action, and the Board responds. A briefing paper on the hate crime legislation was circulated to ministers in January 22. Although it is unlikely that one of our ministers will be charged under existing legislation, the Board would consider what support should be offered centrally on a case-by-case basis. This response is good insofar as it goes, but I believe that more would be appropriate. The possibility of legal action seems to me a significant risk to us as a church and for us as individual ministers and indeed elders. There are a few particular ways in which I think a more robust response would be appropriate. First, this report refers explicitly to existing legislation. I suggest that legislation that we know is being considered on matters like conversion therapy, gender recognition, and other future legislation constitutes to us a greater risk than does the existing hate crimes legislation. We need, therefore, a policy that covers future possibilities as well. And Ben's question earlier and Stephen's response, I think, has brought that home for us. Secondly, the briefing note on Hate Crime Act that was circulated in January. That briefing note concludes the risk of a successful prosecution is thought to be remote in the context of a church following the teachings of the Christian faith, which includes condemning genuine hatred and promoting the good of all people. Again, this is good, and I'm pleased that the board took legal advice on that, and it's good to hear the results of that. But I suggest that there is a distinction between the conclusion in that report from January and what we now have in this report. In January, we heard it is unlikely the risk of a successful prosecution is thought to be remote. The report today says it's unlikely that one of our ministers will be charged. Now, I have no legal expertise whatsoever, but I think there is quite a big difference between being charged and a successful prosecution. And it's good to hear that a successful prosecution is unlikely. But it seems to me that a charge and arrest is enough to constitute a public relations nightmare for our denomination, and more pertinently to my addendum, a nightmare for the minister in question and for his family. We have seen these kinds of arrests in this country in the past few years. People arrested for proclaiming the gospel on the streets. This is not theoretical, and I am unconvinced that it's true that it's unlikely for one of our ministers to be charged. Thirdly, the report speaks of consideration on a case-by-case basis, which in some ways is the only possible policy that we can have, that these things will have to be considered case by case. It is a clear nonsense to suggest that the church commit herself to providing legal support for any minister in any situation. We can easily concoct the scenarios where such support would be clearly inappropriate. But what I suggest is that it's right and proper for us to offer a little more clarity as to what the criteria by which such a case-by-case determination will be made. Further to that, the Board of Trustees, as we know, has a specific remit from the General Assembly. It is a wide and substantial remit, but the Board of Trustees is not responsible for the Church's theology. The Board of Trustees is not responsible for the pastoral care of ministers and their families. These things are located elsewhere. And therefore, a case-by-case assessment that should not be limited to consideration only of matters that are the proper province of the Board of Trustees should therefore not be undertaken entirely by the Board of Trustees, but should be done by a group that includes but is not limited to members of said board. Brethren, as ministers, we are obliged to preach the whole counsel of God. We must do so, whatever the consequences of doing that might be. We have that obligation before God. We also have that obligation as a result of our ordination vows. The second question requires one to sincerely own and believe the whole doctrine of the confession of faith. And the fifth asks, do you promise that through the grace of God you will firmly and constantly adhere to, and in your station to the utmost of your power, assert, maintain, and defend the said doctrine, worship, and so on? Gentlemen, we oblige one another to assert, maintain, and defend this doctrine. We should therefore defend one another in the event that such an assertion results in legal trouble. Thank you.
Thank you, Benjamin. Questions? David Meredith.
Are you suggesting that there is an absolute no-limit legal fees paid, the commitment on behalf of the church for any minister, no matter how they may approach it? Would you not concede that sometimes people are arrested, and when one sees how they behave, one can easily see why they were arrested? So there's a very thin line between being faithful and ridiculous. So how would you advise the trustees in that matter to discern whether someone is being faithful, which we are all agreed on, and ridiculous? Because I have heard some ridiculous things which are not simply faithful.
I agree, and I believe in my original statement I was clear, and that it is a nonsense for us to commit ourselves to provide unlimited financial support for any minister facing legal action in any circumstance. We can, and I'm sure you're right, have heard those ridiculous statements that should not be supported by the church. However, I want to see the policy by which we will determine what is ridiculous and what is faithfulness.
Any other questions? Questions? Okay, I don't think there are any more. Are you prepared to move?
I move in terms of the addendum in the print.
Do we have a seconder? Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We're moving on now to another addendum, which is from James Fraser. In fact, I think the other two addenda are from James Fraser, so stay where you are after the first one.
So is it the
Well,
amendment you wish first?
it's
or
up to you.
I'll take the amendment first. I just want to ask a question before speaking to it. I did have a discussion with the chairman, and the chairman, I think, would be happier if I added a clarificatory, which I'd be very happy to add, but that would involve adding a few words to the amendment, and I'm talking about the amendment, not the addendum. And I just want to check if that's still policy, and I'm not sure if we have it on the screen.
Do we have the updated version on the screen, do we?
I can read it. I can read it.
Oh, well, is the House happy with Mr. Fraser just reading? I guess it's not too long, is it?
It's not. No.
Okay.
And I'll read it now and read it again
Okay.
before people vote.
Okay.
Amendments, tick to the box, but then it says the following addendum.
Not on my
That's
sheet.
Not on my sheet either. It's,
The blue sheet.
it's on the screen. Excellent. Is
Shall
that
I read it?
is that
Yes.
exactly what you want to
Yes.
propose as,
Yes.
as an amendment? Right. Okay.
I'll read the whole amendment, and you'll see that words have been added to it. The Assembly insert after the Chair of the Board of Trustees and before Chair of Mission Board, the Assembly Clerk, the Assistant Clerks, and after 3 members, the following words, provided always that 1 member is the Assembly Clerk or an Assistant Clerk, and this is not in your paper, the next phrase, except where the appointment is of the Principal Clerk. So that if an Assistant Clerk has been appointed, the Principal Clerk has to be there in the appointing panel. But if it's the Principal Clerk himself who's appointed, his assistants are not going to be at the panel. Does everybody understand that?
Does everybody understand what's being proposed as an amendment? Does anyone have any questions? Any questions? Okay, there are no questions. Would you like to move?
I'd like to move the amendment as stated on the screen.
Okay, seconder? Do we have a seconder?
I assume the Assembly Clerk was seconding it, so maybe not.
Do we have a seconder?
I'll second that.
Okay. Seconded by Cal MacLeod. Thank you. All right. Thank you. Thank you.
Do I
We'll
speak
get,
to it at the moment?
no.
No. Okay.
But we'll have the other addendum now.
So when the whole Assembly provides nobody as a seconder, we just turn to the Principal Clerk
No. Well,
and ask him to second it. Is there not even a conflict of interest?
No.
It seemed to me, actually, the fact that there was no seconder Was it the Assembly didn't want to second it?
The principal clerk's a member of Assembly. He has every right to second it.
And is there not a conflict of interest?
I don't really think so. I don't think so, because presumably, I mean, he would not be the principal clerk anymore, so I can't see. No. Okay, we're on to the addendum now, and again, this is being proposed by James Fraser.
The addendum is as on your paper. The appointments group shall recommend any person selected by this process to the General Assembly for approval or otherwise, which in effect means the Assembly has the last shout on this after the selection process is
Does
made.
anyone have any questions? There are no questions. Do you move?
I move.
Is there a seconder?
I'm sorry, I thought.
Yes, there is a seconder. Okay. I'm not sure if you could second it, Gordon, because you have seconded the deliverance.
Yeah.
No?
I'll second it, moderator.
Okay. All right.
May I escape?
Yes. Callum has seconded as a member of Assembly. Okay, so these three amendments and addenda have now been processed. So, speakers, please. Who wants to be first? This is a major report. There are many items in that report, and I hope that we are going to take opportunity to comment, to input. Please do so without fear of any intimidation whatsoever. Yes. What were the rules if you've already...
Not directly towards the amendments on the addenda. It should be okay.
It's going to be on the report itself.
Yeah.
Okay.
Moderator, fathers and brethren, you'll get rid of me at the beginning of the discussion. First of all, I want to welcome the report, and I want to welcome the courage and the foresight of the board in investing for growth, particularly at a time when we've been constantly reminded of rising prices, rising fuel prices, and so on and so forth. And I applaud the chairman for repeating to us that money follows vision. I fervently believe in that principle, and I've rarely been disappointed by it. I just wanted to comment on two things. First of all, the stipends issue. I'm really glad that the board is going to look at stipends again. I think possibly stipends haven't had enough attention, and I've often been at meetings where ministers have tried to stop the board from talking about raising stipends, and I can understand why ministers do that, and I don't say this in a cynical way. It is very noble of ministers to do that, but I think it's our duty as elders perhaps sometimes not to listen to these voices too much. I think we need to be very careful about not raising stipends enough, because very often in the past in congregations, the congregation out of compassion have started giving extra supplements and finding extra ways of giving money to the minister, and they're very often tax inefficient ways of doing it. And of course, any extra money that goes to the minister that way puts pressure on the money that goes to the centre to pay the stipend. So I welcome that commitment. I do wonder if things get bad enough, if the board might have to do something before the beginning of 2023. I also understand the
and applaud the board for trying to grasp this nettle yet again. The nettle we have that, although the principle of mansus is excellent, and I'm fervently keen on it, the principle of mansus often leaves ministers at the end of their ministry in a very difficult situation with their housing. And I do hope the board will get the wisdom and the guidance and the help they need to deal with that conundrum. I think the principle of mansus is very important, and I hope we will always continue to strive to make it possible for new churches to get mansus. We always want people, when they're faced with calling a minister in the church, not to have to worry that because this minister is in an area with low house prices, he can't come to an area with high house prices. So I think the principle of mansus is incredibly important for the spiritual good of the church. So I hope we'll always stick to that principle. That's all I want to say. Thank you very much.
Other speakers? Yep, Ian MacDonald.
Moderator, fathers and brethren, thank you, Donald, for the report and for the clarity and the brevity too. I'm just thinking back of other reports over the years, and it was a very clear report, and I think we've all been challenged by the report. I thank you for the vision that is given to us for growing the church in our day. And I also thank you for the challenges that we've had received from both Neil and from the moderator in both their addresses. And for me personally, it's actually given me a vision for mission. And I thank you for that. And I would encourage every one of us, when we go back to our congregations, to go back and give our congregations that same vision for mission. Because I think to a large extent, we've lost that. And sometimes we're very fearful in the day that we're living in because of all that's going on in the world today. And I was pleased that a particular psalm was sung by both moderators, or selected by both moderators, which again is a missionary psalm, and that is Psalm 67. And I think we need to there's a lens there for us to look into, or to look through in that psalm. And I don't think we should be fearful, because the church is growing in other parts of the world, and we're thankful for that. And perhaps if I were to ask you, where is the church growing the fastest or the greatest in our day? I don't know if you'll be able to answer that, but I heard a statistic that really encouraged me, and that is Africa. Now, when we hear reports of Africa, we actually hear of war and rumors of war and all sorts of difficulties. But the church is actually growing there at a vast rate, and we need to be thankful for that. But what I want to say to us, to encourage us today, is a statement that was made by Adoniram Judson. Now, he was a missionary to Burma. And this is what he said: "The future is as bright as the promises of God." Let me repeat that. The future is as bright as the promises of God. And you know, when we look through this psalm, Psalm 67 that we sang, and also the message that we received from both Neil and Ivor, I think we need to be challenged by what this psalm is saying to us in our day, because we tend to be fearful and we fail to see that the church is actually growing, and we need to grasp that and be encouraged by that as we grow our own church, and as we've been encouraged in these days to grow our church. I also like to quote Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones for our Bible study and our prayers. The Bible is full of promises for each one of us, and we need to pray and remind ourselves and speak about these promises that are there for us in Scripture, because I believe that's what makes us strong in the Lord and in the power of His might to be able to go forward as a church in our day.
Thank you. Other speakers? David Meredith.
Moderator, brethren, I had thought of formulating an addendum which I'm sure would have the wide support of the fathers and brethren, and that was to congratulate the Rangers for winning the Scottish Cup. I had a seconder lined up, but we were too late, so I'm sure the fathers and brethren will echo these sentiments. Just one or two words about the Board of Trustees. The Board of Trustees is often somewhat disparagingly known as Edinburgh. May I suggest that there is no such place as Edinburgh, certainly in Free Church terms. The Board of Trustees is not Edinburgh's Dornoch, it's Back, it's Dingwall, it's Kirkmuir Hill. It is not a cabal of metropolitans who are out of touch with what's going on out in the hinterland. The Board of Trustees are the hinterland, and I think a few things I've certainly appreciated in my 8 years in the Board of Trustees. 3 C's. Number one, a degree of complexity. One thing I've recognised when I've been among the trustees is the wisdom and the wise experts. They deal with complex issues. We had one earlier this week about pensions. Now, that is a really, delicate and complex issue which is not easily dealt with by the General Assembly, who do not have the facts, who do not have the background. So sometimes it is easier to deal with it in the Board of Trustees. And I can assure you that I have been so impressed with the experts there. There is, complexity, and that complexity can only be handled by such a group. So it's very easy to say that, the General Assembly is the highest court of the Church, which of course it is, but it's not always the best forum to deal with these complex issues, because one barnstorming speech can move the Assembly, and sometimes life is a little bit more complex than that. So I have been impressed by its ability to handle complexity. The other C is culture. The famous expression, culture eats strategy for breakfast. The trustees are not mere bureaucrats. Again, as I have observed, they've been missional and entrepreneurial. Financially, we are in an excellent financial position, largely because of the wisdom and the prudence of the General Trustees. The chair of the General Trustees is not going to put the pension fund into bitcoins. The CEO is not going to put it in the 230 at Newmarket. There is prudence there, and I think all of us stand today benefiting from that. So I think thanks is due to them. We did a recent exercise in the trustees, and we looked at what are called the 5 voices in any team, and it was really interesting. There was the pioneer, the creative, the connector, the guardian, and the nurturer. And interestingly enough, we found each of these 5 voices within the Board of Trustees. I'll leave it up to you to decide who the guardian was, the chief guardian, and who the chief pioneer was. The third C is that of colleagues, is a collegiality. And that's not people you normally see, those of us who are up front of house, but people like Fiona Miller, whom you may not have heard of and you don't know, Judy Reid, Sharon, whom we had this morning, Jane Coleman. These are the folk who work in the office, quiet, loyal, faithful people who just get on with it. No little people, no little places. The moderator's wife quoted Schaeffer today, and that's absolutely true. So we are so thankful for that. These folk watch our backs. So we are thankful to the the trustees for their wise stewardship. The best Prime Minister we ever had, without a shadow of a doubt, famously said, and I'm sure you'll all agree with this, the problem with socialism is that eventually you run out of other people's money. Now, there is a grain of truth in that. So thank you for your support, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
I was just listening to the volume of applause to find out how many Thatcherites we had in our assembly. It seems we've got quite a few. More speakers. Yes, Mark MacLeod, please. From
Moderator, fathers, brethren, Mark MacLeod, South Harris. First time being up here, so better introduce myself. A few comments have been made during the report and the discussion afterwards about stipend. And obviously, yes, the cost of living has gone up. We're all very much aware of that. Affects ministers, affects us. Got a young family, certainly affects us as well. But it also affects our congregations, and it affects the income from our congregations as well, especially thinking more of the smaller congregations like our own congregation in South Harris. And that could have a significant effect in terms of the remittance then going up more. If we're going up more than the 500, I presume, don't know the maths, but I presume the remittance goes up even more than whatever the stipend goes up by. So, any more than a 500 increase will have a significant effect on the smaller congregations. And mention was made there as well in terms of the way in which it was maybe noble of ministers to resist these stipend increases. But I think it's probably more than that. It's also protecting some of our smaller congregations as well, for whom this will affect more than anyone else. So just want to note that, and hopefully that'll form the part of the discussion that's made and thinking about the smaller congregations going forward as well, and the impact that would have on them.
all right, more speakers. Who's next?
Moderator, fathers and brethren, I was just going to make a few remarks, principally because Roddy asked a question earlier that I couldn't answer personally around fundraising for church planting and its impact on my mental health. Just for a moment, you sounded like my wife, which is a compliment, as you know. You were her friend before I was. So, and I want to say several things about that. First of all, the Board of Trustees have doubled the amount of money they're giving to church plants for the first 3 years of their life. So that's really helped with the fundraising. That takes quite a lot of the pressure away. And I also agree with what Donald said, that, people follow vision and money follows people. And the fundraising hasn't proven so far to be particularly difficult, but we do need to ramp it up, and your prayers for that would be really appreciated. I don't feel, if we don't get the money, I don't feel particularly bad. I'll do my best, but if it's not on me, ultimately, I'm quite sure of that, and I'm willing to trust that to God. And just, as I made remarks, I think, on Monday night when I was preaching, just about sometimes ministry feels too hard. And I was part of a very interesting discussion recently about why it is that ministry feels too hard sometimes. And the number of ministers saying they're stressed or they're burnt out or they're questioning their future in ministry. And part of the discussion was a kind of insight that I'd never heard before, that most ministers who want to quit It's not because of busyness, it's because of conflict. It's personal conflict that takes away our energy and our appetite for the work. You know, if I have a sleepless night over things, it's not because I'm busy, it's because I'm worrying about tensions or conflicts or difficult situations that I'm having to deal with. So, and I thought that was a good insight for us, you know, that it's not always busyness that grinds us down, but it's actually running up against personal conflict and those kind of difficulties or dealing with conflict. At a personal level, I'm really glad that Andrew Giffen is our CEO. Andrew, you're doing a great job. You spoke so clearly again today, and I think the way you and Donald both articulate the vision for the Healthy Gospel Church is just incredibly helpful. I'm a member of the Board of Trustees, and the discussions are always very positive, constructive, and forward-looking. I think there's a real desire to utilise all the assets of the denomination for the mission of the church, and that's a great help. And there's a real support amongst the trustees for the work of church planting and mission, which is of great encouragement to me personally. So Andrew kindly said to me a couple of weeks ago something that Louise has been saying for a little while, which is, if we don't hit 30, it doesn't matter. You know, it's a number. If we get to it, it's great. But I think Andrew's advice, let's go for quality over quantity and make sure that what we do is good and healthy and growing well rather than just trying to tick boxes. So that was a good rebuke for me, actually. Louise thinks it should be 15 out of 30, or not 30 by 30, but 15 by 30. So we'll see where we get to. And, you know, I can't do two jobs forever. I'm quite aware of that. So, you know, at some point this will get handed off to somebody else. I'd really like to hear other people's view on stipend. You know, I quite often hear the view that we can't raise the stipend to protect smaller congregations. But I think we need a variety of voices on stipend, because I know that there's a lot of financial pressure on our ministers and on those with young families, especially, but now even with older kids, you're supporting them through higher education, and higher education doesn't last 4 years now, it lasts 6 or 7 years. So the financial pressures on families, man's families, are real, and I think we have to grapple with that at a really serious level. I don't think it's fair that ministers be living in debt all the time or under financial pressure. And I think the MANT system is probably finished, is my disagreement with James. I don't often disagree with James, but I think somehow we need to get young ministers equity in the property market. You know, the growing disparity between income and the cost of housing over my time in ministry is unbelievable. You know, I think when I finished at the college, you could buy a flat in Edinburgh for 40 grand in quite a nice place, you know. And over the years, of course, that's just changed out of all recognition. And it's not just happening in the Central Belt, it's happening all over the country, in places like Skye and Harris and elsewhere. So somehow we may keep the MANT system in some sense, but whether it's a shared equity process, but I think to get young men some equity and get them onto the property ladder is our responsibility now, because we can't be leaving men to get to their 60s and they've got nowhere to go. So that's a real challenge. And those capital challenges, you know, these big costs, they relate to the church plants too, getting buildings for them, getting manses. So there's a lot of work still to be done. I think we're at a great place as a denomination. We're moving in a very good direction, but there's huge challenges ahead that need serious thought and prayer, and we continue to need God's good blessing and the support of the denomination as we go forward. So just a few comments on that, and Roddy, thank you for your concern. Okay.
Other speakers? Brian.
Moderator,
Fathers and brethren, I hadn't intended to speak at this point, but the urge to speak on the stipend for ministers as an elder, I do take that seriously. And I think what we do need to then do is look at how do we support the churches that are struggling, at the same time providing a stipend that does not leave our ministers and their families struggling. If you look at the average UK salary for 2021, or certainly in Scotland, it was 26,000, give or take a few pounds. And we're still behind that at the moment. And that's a salary that you would normally expect to increase over the time when you serve in the role that you're working in. My background, for some of you might know, is nursing, and my role within the organisation that I work for involves pay negotiations for nurses. And it would be remiss of me to stand up and say that a nurse, after the degree that they've carried out, starting on a salary of just about 26,000 or just over that, progressing within a few years to in the region of 29,000 is underpaid, if I then did not have a similar view in relation to where our stipend is. And that's a staff nurse. That's not taking account of somebody who then may have even more experience within their role, and perhaps a charge nurse running a ward, managing a team of staff. And I've heard the comparison made before that the charge nurse role might be something akin to a minister, leading a kirk session, leading a congregation, and preaching. And if you want to look at the comparison with a charge nurse role, who will usually need at least 5 years' experience to get that sort of role, they would be approximately 38 to 45,000. Now, I'm not making an argument for that sort of stipend for ministers. And I'm not saying that we should do something that does not take account of the difficulties that those who give in our congregations to support the work face, because they face the cost of living crisis the same as everything else. But one of the things that has struck me during this General Assembly is the real and genuine right concern that we have for looking after our ministers and their families. And for me, that cannot just be, important though it is, about their spiritual well-being or their physical or mental health, but it also must be about how we look after them, because all those things have a link to the stipend that they receive, which for many, if not most, will be the only income that they have. So it was when you said that you wanted to hear the voices from others, I think as an elder, I would want to speak out, say we need to be fair to both our ministers and our congregations and take cognizance. Inflation at the moment this year is running at 9%. A £500 increase is just under 2%. So every time we make a decision to give an increase that is less than the rate of inflation, we are cutting the stipend of our ministers. And that's something that I don't say lightly. I appreciate that congregations face a challenge in our giving, and all of this, brethren, should drive us to our knees before the Lord, who is no man's debtor. Thank you.
Thank you. More speakers? Yes, David MacLeod, please.
Moderator, fathers and brethren, just a short word. And I really want to just say thanks to the Board of Trustees and to Donald for the report that's in our hands, which is encouraging, it's informative, but also, and probably more so, just the attitude that is experienced throughout the year. Sometimes I think it can be true that trustees can be very focused on the detail and the finance and the procedures and the real dense detail without any sense of the big picture. But my observation and my belief is that in the Free Church here, that's certainly not the case. There is a very clear understanding of the big picture, and there's a very clear vision that's come out from the trustees and is constantly coming out through the trustees. There's a willingness to be missional that's very much felt through all the boards, and there's a wisdom that comes from the trustees in guiding us in the work of the mission as a church. So I'm thankful for the attitude and the work that comes through the board of trustees. It's hard for us to understand. Certainly it's hard for me to understand some of the complex things that are in the report, but I'm glad that there are some people in an office who understand these things and to manage them. So just a word of thanks for the clear vision, the healthy gospel church for every community in Scotland, and the willingness to pursue that comes through the trustees. It's not in opposition to the mission board or any other boards. There is a collective view and vision to lift up the name of Jesus, to reach out in the mission that we've been called to. So I'm thankful for the ongoing work.
Thank you, David. Anyone else? Other speakers? Yes, Duncan McPherson.
Moderator, fathers and brethren. I wasn't particularly intending on speaking on this report, but I think questions relating to ministers' salaries and housing are a very important one, and seeing as there has been an appeal to the floor, I thought it would be worthwhile making a few comments on that. I've worked for a large part of my life in the voluntary sector, which typically has lower salaries than the private sector. And the kind of people I work with, someone starting out in work, high 20s, high 20,000 would be the kind of salary they would get. Someone in managerial role, I would say seriously underpaid. They might be getting 32 to 35,000 in a lot of organisations. So that's the kind of level that you're talking about there in terms of low salaries in a sector quite similar to your own. Although it is worth taking into account, obviously, where you have a manse, then that is a benefit in kind. And that's worth considering too. But certainly my view is that the Free Church does underpay its ministers. And I think we do need to pay them better. In relation to solving the housing issue, I don't have any solutions. I do think that manses are incredibly important, precisely for the reason of being able to house ministers properly from the time that they arrive in the community. Our own minister was very gracious when he came to us. We didn't have a manse. We had to rent a house, and it was a good house, but it wasn't big enough for his size of family. And it took us several years to get a manse that was suitable. But we're happy to say that we have that now. And while I very much appreciate David and his family putting up with conditions as they were, I don't think I would want other congregations to be in a similar situation. I would disagree with Neil saying that we have a duty to help ministers get on the housing ladder. It's very easy as we look at the world today and think where we are today has happened because It's just the way things are happening, and it will inevitably continue that house prices will rise and rise and rise. House pricing today is a direct result of specific policies in place by specific governments over a number of decades. And that's why housing is so expensive today. And these policies can and are likely to change. And if we help ministers to get on the housing ladder today when houses are expensive, we could easily create another problem of in 20, 30 years' time when houses are relatively more cheap, of putting ministers into difficulties in relation to issues such as negative equity. When I left university in the 1980s, there was a housing boom. One of my flatmates bought a flat for what seemed an incredibly ridiculous sum of, I don't know, it was like £28,000 at the time. But 2 years later, when there was a major recession on the go and his employer wanted to move him from the town he was in to another town, he couldn't physically do it because if he tried to sell his house, his mortgage was worth more than what the actual flat itself was worth. And I think we could risk creating that kind of a problem for ministers. I think possibly a good idea would be for the trustees to consider, can they support ministers by providing or enabling them to access independent financial advice throughout their period of ministry, so they can have regular views with professionals who can help them to think through the issues of preparing for retirement. I know that some ministers do have and plan well ahead and do actually own accommodation which they rent out to other people and then move into it themselves when they retire. These issues aren't easy to address without a doubt, but I think we can certainly help ministers on that. And I do think that paying ministers more will also help them to prepare better for retirement. I fully take on board Mark's point about small congregations, but I think also if we honour the Lord's servants, then I think the Lord will honour us with providing us with more resources and giving us more people who are more generous in terms of their giving.
Thank you, Duncan. Other speakers? Okay, I'm going to bring things to a conclusion then. I think it's clear that there are no other speakers. I'm looking around, I don't see any hands up, no indications, so I'm going to ask Donald to sum up, and then we're going to think about how we deal with the amendments and addenda. Can I ask a question, Donald? I'm doing this while Callum's doing something else, so that because I might be breaking the rules, but I'm just going to ask you if it's possible for you to say a bit more about the communications section in the report, like where we're at with the communications group and all that kind of thing. Yeah.
So a couple of words on communications group. So as we've covered earlier, communications group was set up at the request of last year's General Assembly. The group has been formed. The group has met. The group is still in need of a chair. The group is next meeting 23rd of June or thereabouts. And as you know, it has a big remit in terms of having ultimate responsibility for all internal and external communications. There are a couple of areas in particular that I would like the communications group to look at. One is the almost ever-present issue of what's the website for? You know, we often have discussions about should Article X or item Y be on the website. I think the current thinking on the website is that the website is primarily a shop window. It's a shop window into the Free Church. It's primarily for non-Free Church people to find out about the Free Church, which is why it starts off with who are we and how to find a local church. But clearly there's lots of content for members on the website too. So I'd certainly like to revisit and have an agreement on what the website is for and how we use it. That will include a discussion on whether we publish all the PEG responses on the website or not. To date, we've done some and we haven't done others, and could talk forever as to the whys and wherefores of that. So communication group's been formed, it has met. We're still, as I say, we need one member and we need a chair, and I think we've identified a chair, but I don't want to give that name just now because that person hasn't necessarily agreed to do it. But clearly it's a very important group. I suppose fundamentally, we've been discussing that everything the church does is about mission, and everything the church does is about communication. We communicate the gospel. That's what we do. It's quite surprising how bad we've been at communication internally and in terms of our PR and whatnot, given that we're an organisation that is about communication. I'm happy to take any questions, if that's in order, about the communications group. Yeah.
If anyone has any questions about communications, then do so. It just occurred to me that we haven't given any time to it, and that may be the mind of the Assembly, but if there are any questions, then now's the chance. No questions. Fine. If you can conclude then.
Okay, so moderator, if I could just clarify what I'm supposed to do now. Yeah. I think what I'm supposed to do is to summarise and then comment on the amendments.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I'll do that. Okay. I'd like to thank everyone for their contributions. We had a fascinating range of questions before lunch, dealing from everything from conversion therapy to heritage assets to history questions, and fundraising, manses and stipends, which have been a recurring theme this afternoon. And I'd like to thank James, Mark, Neil, Brian and Duncan. I think you all commented on stipends, and clearly we've touched a button there that needs to be addressed. And the related issue of housing, and thanks again to James and Neil and Duncan who all commented on housing. I enjoyed David Meredith's point. He had his 3 C's of complexity, culture, and collegiality. And I want to emphasize something that David said. You referred to the good financial position that we're in. And I wouldn't want anyone to think that we're in a good financial position because of what the Board of Trustees has done in the past couple of years. We're in a good financial position because of work that has gone on for 20 years or so. It's been a long road to talk about, we're in a good financial position. So credit goes to people who have served before me for the good financial position, and for people who have given generously also. I was really pleased when David was talking about culture, how he touched on the 5 voices. So, as I mentioned in our report, the board has been working on its own health. And this might sound like a strange thing to say, but we've been trying to encourage healthy debate, healthy conflict on the board. The board is positive. We are all fully behind the vision statement. We're all working well, I believe, with other boards. And we have to be really careful that we just don't fall into a kind of groupthink. So we're actively trying to encourage healthy challenge and healthy conflict. And that's why we have board advisors who are non-Free Church people. It just, I say, broadens the lens. And that's why I genuinely welcome feedback. If you have any feedback, please phone me, please email me, and then I'll phone you, because I really want to hear the feedback. And at our board meetings, I really prize the contributions of the ministers. Because the board is kind of half ministers, half non-ministers, and the non-ministers are in the large guys like me who wear suits for a living. And it's really so important that we get the feedback from the ministers at the coalface, so that we don't end up in a kind of Edinburgh ivory tower. We really need the feedback. I'd like to thank Ian Alistair for his comments on vision and mission, and for Neil's comments about funding. And I was taken back by Neil's comment about conflict. Conflict is best addressed early, and that's difficult to do. Now, there's a whole body of knowledge about conflict, about how to manage conflict, about how to bring about resolution, how to de-escalate conflict. And this is perhaps a board of ministry issue, perhaps rather than a board of trustees issue, but there's no reason why we can't tap into that body of knowledge and provide that as part of the CPD training for ministers. There's probably lots of people in this room who have dealt with conflict. If you have a legal background or many other professional or social work backgrounds, you'll have dealt with conflict for a living. So there's no reason why we can't tap into that body of knowledge. I'd like to make a couple of other comments. The board is focused on strategy and vision. It's not focused on detail. And there's hundreds of questions that you could ask me that I wouldn't know the answer to, and I'd have to call on Andrew. And even then, Andrew might have to email somebody else. But Andrew has much more detailed knowledge than I do. And I think it's right that the board focuses on strategy, it focuses on vision, and it's right that we leave the detailed management to the CEO and his office. That's their professional role. That's what we pay them for. So the board of trustees doesn't interfere in the day-to-day workings at the centre. We hold Andrew to account in terms of budgets for the centre, but he has the leeway that he must have if he's going to do his job, properly. So the board does focus on strategy and vision. So I think that's all I want to say in terms of summary. If I could move on to the amendments, and I'll just deal with them in the order that they were raised. So Benjamin raised the important issue about the hate crime and potential prosecution of ministers. So Benjamin, thank you for bringing that up. I think in terms of a minister being charged or prosecuted, given that we live in an age of live stream, whatever offence or alleged offence, it would be on video. Perhaps that increases the chance of prosecution, I'm not sure. The Hate Crime and Public Order Act, Scotland, 19 whatever, the Hate Crime Act does set quite a high bar for prosecution in terms of the comments must be threatening and abusive and have the intention of stirring up hatred. So I would really hope that none of our ministers would say something threatening and abusive and have the intention of stirring up hatred. Nevertheless, it's not beyond the realms of possibility, and as Benjamin said, the goalposts are shifting, and have perhaps even shifted since January when we issued that paper. So I treat this issue as, I'm going to call it a Partygate issue, in terms of I can't make rules apply to other people that don't apply to me. So if the ministers in our church want that, then I think they have to be given that. I think it would be completely wrong for me to say, oh no, we're not going to do that. So I'm very content to accept Benjamin's amendment and actually thank him for it. I continue?
Yes, yes.
Okay, I wasn't sure I'd done something wrong there. And I'd like to thank James for his 2 amendments. James is a great wordsmith. Anyone who's known James for more than 5 minutes will know that he's a great wordsmith. And I think actually both of James's amendments actually just kind of sharpen the text. I think I can say with clear conscience that's what we intended. So I'm very happy to accept both of James's amendments also.
So you're accepting Benjamin's as well?
Yes. So accepting Benjamin's amendment and James's 2
Excellent.
amendments also about the General Assembly approving appointments and about the role of the Clerk Assembly Clerk in the appointments group.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Donald. Thank you very much for a comprehensive report. It's a great joy to be on the Board of Trustees and to have you as our chairman, and we're in safe hands.
Thank you.
The next item is the supplementary report. Supplementary report? Yes. Okay. Let's take a 5-minute comfort break, please. Thank you.
Right, take your seats, please. We're going to have the next report.
That's me told.
Moderator, if I can just take a step back before we take a step forward, and with regard to the addendum by Benjamin Wilkes, the second paragraph of that addendum reads that the committee shall be appointed by the General Assembly and comprise 6 members, including the CEO, the Principal Clerk, the Public Engagement Coordinator, and 3 additional members appointed by the General Assembly, including at least 1 other minister, at least 1 other elder, and at least 1 member of the Board of Ministry. The General Assembly takes up a slot for appointments tomorrow morning, so it's important for commissioners to give some thought to who the General Assembly could appoint to fill these slots on that group. So please bear that in mind as we prepare for tomorrow. We're now ready to move on to the Board of Trustees' supplementary report. I want to make sure, first of all, that everybody's got a copy of the amendment by Neil D. M. MacLeod. Anybody needing a paper copy of? Mother, Father, and Brother, because of the nature of this report, we want to split it up and to proceed as follows. We want to take part A of the report, first of all, which is on the questions and formula. James Fraser will present that part of the report, and then questions will be taken only with regard to that section of the report. And once we finish questions on part A, part B on discipline will be presented by Stephen Allison, and James Fraser will give a clarification with regard to a repeated paragraph in the report, which is on section B, paragraph 3.2. And if you note that paragraph, there is a repetition of wording. The paragraph numbering is, of course, different, but there is a repetition, and James will clarify that when he comes, before Stephen comes to present that part of the report. With regard to that, it's important to remember that the focus in that part of the report is on the process and the principles, and not on the detail of what a potential or prospective act might look like. It's on the process and on the principles, and of course the detail is important, but today we are looking for agreement on the process, and if we can achieve that, then the Act of Assembly that will be considered, that is under consideration, will be formed likewise. So focusing on the process and the principles, and not so much on the detail, because we don't want to get lost in the detail at the expense of not understanding the process. After Stephen has presented that part of the report, there'll be a time for questions, and Stephen or James or anybody on the PMG will answer questions, but a time for questions. And then, after having heard both parts of the report and time for questions on both parts of the report, then James will formally move the report, and I will be seconding the report. And at that point, we'll take up the amendment from Neil D. M. MacLeod, and he will move and second that report, and there will be, well, he will present the report, there will be a time for questions, then he will move and have a seconder. And at that point, we'll pass on to discussion and debate. And once the debate has been completed, then the summing up will be given by James Fraser.
Is that the view of the floor? Okay, thank you. Thank you.
So I pass my documentation to the moderator. So
well, it's important that I follow through the procedure that we've just agreed.
Thank you, yes. Stephen Wright is not a member of Assembly, so
Does he have the permission of the House?
Yeah.
Thank you. So we are now going to have Part A of the supplementary report, and that's going to be presented by James Fraser.
Moderator, fathers and brethren, it's my great honour to present this really very important supplementary report, and I'm referring to Part A at the moment because we're going to deal with Part A first. We had a very interesting address from the moderator, and he reminded us that we're not a collection of congregations, we are a church, and it's more than a collection of congregations, and that we are a church that bows to the authority of Scripture. But you can bow to the authority of Scripture, but if you don't enforce it and can't enforce it, the bowing is not really very helpful. And this is really what this section is about. It's about ensuring as far as we can that we follow the confession that we've signed up to. Now, I won't take a lot of time because I think the report is clear. We were asked to modernize the language, shorten and break up some questions. We wanted to know if that was constitutional, if we're allowed to do that, and if there would be any dangers to the church if we charged ahead. And we got a very clear opinion from Council that said, yes, it's constitutional. You must be careful not to depart from the principles that underlie and infuse these words, but you can modernize the language, shorten and break up the questions. So we knew what we had to do, and we knew what dangers we had to avoid. We consulted presbyteries, all the presbyteries, and we tried to meld together as best we could the views the presbyteries gave, and came out with a draft on that basis. The next question really was whether or not we'd succeeded in making these changes without breaking this rule that we should not depart from the underlying principles. Now, that is not entirely a question for a lawyer, although the skills and the knowledge of a lawyer are very relevant to that question because lawyers spend a lot of time worrying about what words mean. Instead, we decided that we should ask the church, with, of course, the approval of the Board of Trustees, we're a subcommittee of it, that we should ask the church for an opinion, and that this opinion should have theological expertise, it should have expertise from people who are used to church practice, and it would be helpful to have this legal professionality as well. So we set up this little group of which the principal of ETS was a member, and I think, if I remember rightly, chaired it, and hence theology. We asked a former Assembly clerk, James McKeever, hence practice, and we asked Ruth Charteris, QC, who's a member of the church, to join this group. And we asked them whether, in their view, what we did conformed to the requirements of the QC's opinion. And they came back to us with several points, and we modified the document to take the points into account. So what you have before you in column, the right-hand column of the report, what you have of the deliverance, what you have before you is what came out of that process. And this is all I wish to say about it at this moment. I'm happy to take questions, and I think the Assembly has said that if necessary, Stephen, who is the Vice Chairman, can also come up and answer questions. If you ask me difficult legal questions, undoubtedly, I will hope you'll come up and deliver me.
Thank you, James. Thank you. Questions? Any questions? And we're only discussing the questions and formula. Part A right now. Part A, questions and formula. And as they are in the print, you'll find them on page 65 onwards. Yes, Benjamin Wilkes, please.
Thank you, James, for summarising the process and for how that's helpfully set out in the document. Just regarding kind of that final step, the document was further revised to meet the concerns expressed and is presented for approval. Did that committee agree that their concerns had been addressed? Did you ask them?
Yes, I think I can't remember the formality of the asking, but
as far as I know, the committee did not meet again, but as far as I could see, these concerns had been addressed.
Thank you.
Any questions? Any other questions? Martin Walker, please.
Moderator, fathers and brethren, this was obviously a monumental piece of work, and I must say, reading over this, I was very impressed by what I saw. But I just want to ask one question. If we take the right-hand column and the first page and the new wording under number 3, box number 3, the question is, do you own and acknowledge the Presbyterian Church government to be the only government of this church? Now, I'll stop there. Now, there's obviously a footnote because it's a little 3 next to government. So you drop down to 3, and it then defines what church government, Presbyterian church government is, which used to appear in its entirety in the old reading. My question is, does the footnote have the same validity as the question as we move forward?
my understanding is that the document, including the footnotes, is the document that you're approving. My understanding is that the questions that will be asked in public will be the questions that are in these boxes.
Right. The thing I would then ask, if we think 10, 20 years ahead, and this is then being used, the people who will hear the question put, whether it's the ordinand or the person asking the question or the ordinary people in the pew, will they understand that there's actually a footnote there?
Stephen.
Excellent. So I guess the point is that the footnote is part of the Act of Assembly. So the footnotes are part of the Act of Assembly, and they are explaining something that should be understood. And so partly it's the idea of trying to shorten the language to convey the same meaning, and partly it's to kind of make things clearer. The footnote is part of the Assembly. Interestingly, very few people raised any issues about the footnotes when it was presented to all the different people we presented it to. But our intention is it's part of the Act of Assembly, so it remains on the books of the church, and that's the authoritative interpretation of the question. It's not read out and explained because that would just lengthen the whole process. But it is part of the Act of Assembly and is not being dropped from our authoritative explanation of the Act.
Right. Thank you.
I think Martin's question is very helpful because we did have a discussion on whether we should have the whole text in the Act or not. And I think it's at the level of being where the Assembly should decide, do we want what's in the footnote in the question or not?
Well, is that a motion? I mean,
you'd have to suspend it. Sorry. You'd have to suspend it.
We're at questions at the moment.
Can I make an observation which might help in this? I would hope that this isn't the only occasion when congregations are told what the Presbyterian system of government of our church is. And I kind of thought that was the impact of the moderator's address. I think we've forgotten these things a wee bit, and we've forgotten to teach our people. And I'd be appalled if the only time anybody wondered what Presbyterian government was when they heard these questions asked. So I really do wonder if we're looking for a solution that's to be found elsewhere.
Any other questions? Alison Macaulay.
Moderator, I'm not sure if this should be in the questions or in the comments. But I'm going to formulate it as a question. But
Well, I'm not sure if I can allow that, unless it's a real question.
it is a question, but it might sound cheeky being formulated as a question, and I don't mean to, because
But there will be an opportunity for comments later on.
It's a question. I appreciate the work that's been done, brilliant, and I've really compared them all. There's just one word, I think, why is that still in there? So I'm on page 67, question 9, although it appears elsewhere, the word tenets. If I say the word tenets, I'm just wondering how many of us know what that means. When you read it in the question, I think we can work out what it means. But I did have to go Google it to find out, okay, I've obviously,
You've signed
I know I've signed up to these, but had a general idea.
This is an example of...
had a general idea of what I was saying, because it goes with, do you renounce all doctrines, tenets, or opinions, contrary to, etc. But just at a point where everything else seems much clearer than it was, are we too late to change this word to principles or something?
You may be pressing at the limits here, because the word tenets never occurred to me as a word people would have difficulty with, and I'm not sure if it occurred to other people as well. I feel a bit uncomfortable about putting in any change to this document, because it's such an important document. And maybe you'll think it a little frivolous of me to say it was always a great principle in education that you put one little thing in that was a wee bit difficult so that people did the work. So you might perhaps accept it on that basis.
I'm justified in being wary of presenting it as a question, because clearly he knows fine what tenets means and I didn't. So I'm happy.
Any other questions? Why is everybody on their phones Googling? Any other questions?
Do I take it there are no other questions on the questions and formula? Now is the chance. Okay. All right. In that case, that puts it to bed for the moment. We're going to come on now to part B, and this is...
So I don't move it at this stage?
No, not at this stage, right. No. Do we move it separately? Do you expect to move separately, or...?
Both sections of the end.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's what I have here. Okay, part B, if you could present it, please.
Okay, part B, first of all, if the House can bear with us, there was a typing error, really, or something of that kind in the report itself, and a very sharp-eyed commissioner pointed this out to me last night. It had escaped the eyes of many people. And that is coming up on the screen. Some of you will... All of you will have noticed that the content of paragraph 3.3 and the content of paragraph 3.2 were the same, although the headings were different. How many people haven't spotted that? Anyway, this is what should have been underneath the heading, which makes more sense, of course.
Okay.
I would like to invite Stephen Allison, who's the Vice Convener, to present this part of the report.
presuming you'll move my slides on when I ask for... go back for the minute, though. Moderator, fathers and brethren, thank you for permission to address the Assembly in relation to the Project Management Group's proposals on discipline. Moderator, let me first congratulate you on your appointment as moderator. Thank you for your address yesterday, which highlighted so many of our fundamental principles we hold to as the Free Church of Scotland. It reminded me of many of the men of old who believed it was vital to understand and articulate our Free Church principles afresh to each new generation. Some of them, such as Henry Moncrieff, William Wilson, wrote books of a collection of lectures on Free Church principles, and perhaps the moderator would give some consideration to expanding upon his wonderful work yesterday and maybe publishing something. The Assembly agrees. And it's great that what we're being able to do today with the questions and formula, this is, in my view, one of the most radical changes to the Free Church constitutional document since 1846, but one which rightly seeks to communicate our principles in the language of today, and it expresses them in a way that people are more understandable. I also appreciate the moderator's commendation of the doctrines of the Westminster Confession of Faith, completely support the idea that we need to make better use of the riches therein contained. But the Westminster Confession of Faith is our subordinate standard, and as our subordinate standard, it's not sufficient to protect our church's orthodoxy, which takes me to the matter I'm here to address the Assembly on today. Last week, I listened to Ian Hamilton's sobering and challenging lecture at the Gospel Reformation Network on the history and theological declension of the Church of Scotland. Within it, he pointed out from the history of the Church of Scotland from 1560 to date that just having the right standards, the Bible, the Westminster Confession, is no guarantee of orthodoxy. You can have the right standards on paper and do nothing with them, which is why biblical discipline is required. The next slide. John Knox is, of course, well known for including discipline within his marks of the Church. At a debate in another place earlier this week, it was noted that the statue of John Knox is covered up as he was looking on at what was being done in the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland. But in our assembly, we would not cover up the statue of Knox. We want it, and so we take these principles from 1560. The notes, therefore, of the true Kirk of God we believe, confess, and avow to be, first, the true preaching of the Word of God, in which God has revealed himself to us. Secondly, the right administration of the sacraments, which must be annexed to the word and promise of God to seal and confirm the same to our hearts. And thirdly, ecclesiastical discipline, uprightly ministered as God's word prescribed, whereby vice is repressed and virtue is nourished. And that, of course, highlights the importance that discipline that we practice as a church has to be administered as God's word prescribes. It's vital that all the proposals we're going to be bringing forth in future to the commissions, assemblies, wherever it may come, that the reform of our discipline structure has to look at the underlying principles of God's word. Our processes need to be fair, robust, accessible, complete, pastorally sensitive, ensuring that the church acts justly to all parties. As the PMG began our work, we immediately recognised that discipline was an area of church practice and procedure most in need of reform in our church, and most likely to open the church to the risk of litigation. When I graduated from Edinburgh Theological Seminary, I was employed by the church to undertake a review of our current discipline structures, and that exposed many of the areas of weakness. I prepared a discussion paper, and we began to consult with various people across the church so that we could think about how discipline could be reformed within our church. That included members of the PMG group, but it also included others in the church. At the 2019 General Assembly, I delivered a presentation on some of the weaknesses of our current discipline system and showed the central idea of our restructuring proposals was that we need the appropriate experience and skills to help us do our work in discipline. That would ensure consistency across the church and that the appropriate people were conducting full and fair investigations. I prepared a draft act on discipline reform that was discussed at length with the PMG. Many amendments, changes have been made to this kind of work over the years. A version of that act was sent to some individuals in the church with procedural and pastoral experience for comments. A version was sent to the Board of Trustees, Board of Ministry for comments. And each time the act was evolving and changing, Each act was really a discussion starter and was never intended to be final. And in fact, the structure we're proposing today it doesn't match a lot of those early drafts of the Act. But it was a hugely beneficial process to improve and refine our thinking. As the PMG, we've been seeking to speak with many people, get many views. The Board of Trustees took legal advice on the proposals from the church's lawyers and sought advice from the two external advisors to the Board of Trustees that Donald mentioned in his report, one of whom is an HR advisor and one is a legal advisor. We've held extensive discussion sessions with those advisors, meeting with the HR advisor, legal advisor, and also with the principal of ETS to discuss some of the underlying theological questions underpinning discipline. We reported to the next slide, we reported to the 2021 General Assembly, or the Board of Trustees did, included something from the PMG within their report, that it was the intention to bring forward proposals. The board will bring forward proposals to the General Assembly or to one of its commissions when the consultation process has been completed. They empower the Commission of Assembly to take up a report from the board with final proposals on this matter. But we didn't bring an act to the commissions because the consultation process is still ongoing. And we're not quite ready yet to present a final act to the Assembly either. We're still seeking to get it finalised in a form that is acceptable to a large number of people. And so in today's report, we wanted to update the Assembly on some of the major principles in our revision so that there can be some discussion on those important principles, and seeking the permission to bring the final act to either the Commission of Assembly for approval, or if it takes longer and it comes to next year's General Assembly. But basically to continue that remit that was given in the 2021 General Assembly. Given the importance of discipline, the overture that is presented to a commission or an assembly would have to go down under the Barrier Act for approval by all of our presbyteries before coming back to a General Assembly for final approval. This is the process that we use for matters affecting fundamental principles of our church, that we don't just pass them in one assembly. We have this extensive period of consultation, discussion, and bringing it back. The Act is close to completion, and as soon as that is done, the PMG intends to carry out a consultation with presbyteries, boards, and committees of the church prior to the Act being presented to the Commission. We consulted extensively on the questions and formula and took back feedback. We would do the exact same again. Any suggestions that were feeding in, we'd try and incorporate into the final Act before it's presented to the Commission, goes down to presbyteries under the Barrier Act, and then comes to a future General Assembly, all of which bodies would scrutinise the proposals. So I want to turn to some of the principles underlying the reform. And I think it's important for commissioners to first of all understand some of the context of our reforms by understanding a little about the history of discipline within the Free Church of Scotland. History matters to what we do as a church, as our moderator said and as others have said. The foundation of discipline goes back to the form of process of 1707. And it might surprise you that that Act from 1707 is still the main piece of legislation governing the discipline of ordinary church members by local kirk sessions. We're not proposing a change to that Act at the moment. Our reforms are focused on the discipline procedures to be applied to office bearers within the church, ministers, elders, deacons. At a later date, more work will need to be done to then work on the local kirk session. But obviously, there's a degree of formality with office bearers that you don't want to be bringing into local congregational level and discipline. So there needs to be a balance. If you go to the next slide, the form of process underwent a major revision in 2010 with the introduction of the Judicial Commission. Many of you by now, because I keep telling people, know the Judicial Commission, which was appointed in 2010, has never met. There's never been a case that's involved the Judicial Commission. The issue in 2010 that underlied the motivation for reform was an important principle. Pre-2010, the presbytery were both the investigators and the judges of a discipline case. And that was seen as contrary to natural justice, to have the same person investigating and then judging. And so the 2010 Act after about 10 years of committee discussion, so we're not doing bad at 4 years, the 2010 Act introduced the Judicial Commission. And the idea in that, and this is what should govern in the Free Church at the moment, but is not being universally practiced, is that the presbytery are responsible for investigating a case against the minister. And if the minister denies the allegations, the presbytery present the case before the Judicial Commission, who act as judge. The Judicial Commission is drawn from other presbyteries, includes ministers and elders of at least 10 years' experience. It's worth noting the system I'm describing at this point is for ministers. When it comes to elders, the Kirk Session investigate and present it before the presbytery, but the process is essentially the same. For the majority of what I'm going to say as we go through the new process, for illustration purposes, I'm going to talk about ministers, but it's worth knowing that there will be a slight difference in which court governs, but it's essentially the same process. Here's the problem that we've found since the Judicial Commission was introduced. Turns out, presbyteries are not very good at investigating complaints. I'm sorry, you maybe don't want to hear that, but there's been many cases that have occurred in our church since 2010 where that's been proven to be true. Most of us, as ministers and elders, have no experience of running a robust investigation. There are inconsistencies between presbyteries, record keeping is patchy, and people ask the wrong questions and go back to witnesses many times to try and get to some version of what happened. Poor investigations are letting us down in our processes and causing harm to the people involved in our processes because they are caught up in what seems like an endless process and which seems like a process that is so badly run. Also, we often don't obey other acts of the Assembly, which was highlighted at a previous General Assembly, where if a woman is being interviewed by a church court, she should have a friend invited to come along with her. Or if there are vulnerable witnesses, we should take steps to protect them. But we're often not doing any of this. Initially, we thought we could improve the process by introducing a central committee to help the presbytery to investigate, and any outdated drafts that have circulated may have had that structure in it. But it was far too complicated. It had multiple appeals going on. It led to hearings before the presbytery and before the Judicial Commission, and it was far too complicated, which is why we were consulting with people and getting people's views. We went back to the drawing board and realised that our mistake was we were starting at the 2010 Act. So we went back before the 2010 Act to the initial problem, that presbytery was both the investigator and the judge and can't do both. In 2010, the judging function was moved to the Judicial Commission, but the investigation was left with the presbytery. Surely that is the wrong way round. The presbytery's job, function, our church court's function is to make decisions, is to sit as the equivalent of a bishop, I suppose, over our ministers. The presbytery is the decision-making body. So if you go to the next slide, what if instead we reversed that decision in 2010? Rather than removing the judge function from the presbytery, we restored the historic principle of Presbyterianism, that it is our brethren in a presbytery who sit in judgment over our whatever the complaint is. And instead, we take the investigation function away from presbytery. And that's where we're hoping to introduce this idea of a conduct and complaints committee, who will have expertise, who will know how to run an investigation, who will keep good records, who will ensure consistency across our church. They will prepare a detailed report which enables the presbytery to make good decisions. So that change is the most important thing, I think, to try and get into your head to understand what I'm about to go through. That the idea is that investigation is done by experts who present to the presbytery, and we restore presbyteries acting as decision maker, as judge, restoring our vital principle of Presbyterianism, that judgment is by our peers rather than an external group. So what would our new process look like? So if you turn to page 71 of your papers, you'll see the diagram. If you go to the next slide, this first half of it will appear on the screen, but I understand that's probably tiny and unreadable by people, so you should have a diagram in front of you. The new process begins with every complaint, every issue being raised, being passed on to the Conduct and Complaints Committee. This is to ensure adequate recording. It's to ensure that a presbytery clerk doesn't decide, actually, I don't think that thing's important to tell anyone about, so I'll just deal with it myself. Instead, it's passed on to the complaints committee to think about it. A triage group is established, including the chair and vice chair of the Conduct Complaints Committee and the clerk of the relevant presbytery. So you're bringing in the presbytery's experience alongside those who will eventually be involved in investigating, perhaps. The triage process decides what this matter relates to. Is it completely frivolous and we shouldn't really be doing anything with it? Is it very minor and a local resolution will deal with it, but we might want to record it for the future? Is it a conduct issue? Is it an issue of congregational health or capacity of the minister where support can just be given? Is it an issue of heresy? And in heresy, we've been very bad at dealing with this in the past. Heresy is persistent insistence on a wrong doctrine. We often, maybe it's just me, but most ministers occasionally we say things from the pulpit that aren't right. We are not going into detailed systematic theological study every time. We might say something offhand that isn't quite 100% right. But if my brother points it out to me, I might say, oh yeah, you're absolutely right, that's not what I meant. That's not heresy. That's just us helping one another and supporting one another. Heresy is where we're saying something radically wrong. The minister's saying, I stick by this. And then we want a process where the church determines, through the use of our seminary, our principal clerk, whether or not the church has a settled opinion on the question. If the church does have a settled opinion on the question, it's put back to the minister to say, does he now accept it? Or it's brought to the church to decide if we have a settled opinion on it, if it's a matter of importance with theological study. If it's not a question, some questions of doctrine we can disagree with legitimately. They're areas of Christian liberty. And if it's one of those questions, the committee might say, this isn't a matter for heresy. But that process would happen first before we get into the normal discipline procedure, because someone might receive a report from a theological study group looking at an issue and say, actually, I was wrong, I accept that, and there should be no penalty for us making mistakes. We all make mistakes. But I want to now go through the kind of conduct process of discipline to illustrate how it goes through.
I wonder if I can interject at this point. We do have an order of the day at 4 o'clock. So I don't know how you want to, you can stop at some suitable point and then return to it after the reception of delegates, but I'm just alerting you to that fact.
Well, I think maybe this is an appropriate point to stop in that case, because we're about to go through just the process for a conduct complaint, which is probably its own distinct area, moderator.
Thank you. So we'll return to that later on. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you. And okay, so I think it's probably the most appropriate thing just to have the order of the day now. And then, of course, we'll return to the questions. David Meredith is going to introduce the delegates. Yes, Jonathan.
Moderator, it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Mr. Jonathan Winch. I know there's a degree of irony in that you have met him before. I met him. One of our own poets famously once said, "We don't do England," and that may or may not be true. But may I introduce you to Mr. Jonathan Winch from the Evangelical Presbyterian Church of England and Wales, and they most certainly do England. Thank you.
Mr. Winch, welcome to the Assembly. Please bring the greetings of your denomination.
Well, thank you indeed, moderator. And moderator, fathers, brothers, I want to thank the moderator and all of you for giving me such a warm welcome, for a delicious lunch, for great company, and for, of course, arranging for Piper to stand just outside the church for most of the day and remind me that we are actually in the best part of the United Kingdom. And music apart, I want to suggest that our two countries have much in common. And maybe I can drive the point home by telling you a brief story. I was a head teacher for 12 years on Tyneside, and on one occasion I had a friend from America who's a minister and a former professional footballer staying in my home, and I said to him on the Sunday night, "How do you fancy speaking to 1,000 young people?" And he said, "Okay, no problem, I'd love to." So the following morning, 8 o'clock, we're standing there, the room begins to fill up, there's 1,000 of them, and he stands up and he's at the microphone, a little bit like me, speaking to people whom he doesn't know, and he delivers the following immortal words. "Men and women of Gateshead," he said, "I perceive that you are in every way very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also a T-shirt with this inscription: football is my religion and Newcastle United is my God." And he took it from there. So don't we have much in common? Even at the General Assembly of the Venerable Free Church of Scotland, football has to be mentioned. And I can tell you for sure that Newcastle United would be mentioned in a similar context in our city. It's what we're known for all around the world. But the humor of it is dulled a little bit by the fact that that's true, isn't it? We are living in a very religious society, you and I. The Evangelical Presbyterian Church in England and Wales is ministering in a very religious society, just like you. The only difficulty is it's no longer the religion of Jesus Christ. And therefore, I want to leave with you a single verse from 1 Chronicles and chapter 12. Fathers and brothers, moderator, it is a verse that you'll be familiar with. It is from an otherwise obscure chapter, but it has so much to say and so much encouragement to deliver. Of Issachar, men who had understanding of the times, 200 chiefs and all their kinsmen under their command. The chapter, of course, is listing the armed delegations from the tribes. And they come from each of the tribes. From one tribe, Zebulun alone, there are 50,000 men armed to the teeth. And then come these 200 men from Zebulun. And the comment is made of them, not that they were experts in war, but that they had understanding of the times to know what Israel ought to do. I think if I were David, those are the men I would wish to have. And Matthew Henry says they understood the political times. They understood political affairs and public affairs, the temper of the nation, and the tendencies of the present events. And as I'm sitting amongst you today and I'm listening to the things that are engaging your attention, it resonates with me because these are the very things that are demanding our attention the other side of the border. The likelihood that men from this body will at some point face hostility to the extent that we are called to give an account to the law, although we describe ourselves as Her Majesty's dutiful citizens, and rightly so. The likelihood that we will be ministering, and certainly our sons will be ministering in a hostile world, a post-Christian world. Now, in some sense, what the men of Zebulun had concluded, I say Zebulun, Issachar had concluded, was very, very simple. The times are desperate, and there is only one man who can answer those times, and that man is David. Now, let me bring you a little bit closer in time to almost exactly to the day 280 years ago. And John Wesley is writing in his journal. I'm going to quote to you from it. Thursday, the 27th of May, we left Birstall And on Friday the 28th, we came to Newcastle upon Tyne. About 6, after a short refreshment, we walked into the town. I was surprised. So much drunkenness, cursing and swearing, even from the mouths of young children, I do never remember to have seen or heard before in so small a compass of time. Surely, this place is ripe for him who came not to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. Wesley was a man who understood the time. He understood that the times were desperate. Some historians place the 18th century as at a lower point than our current time, certainly in terms of the health of the church. Where were the gospel churches? Wesley had to preach outdoors for a reason, didn't he? But he understood that only great David's greater son could meet the need of the hour. And more than that, he understood that Christ himself was going out to seek and to save that which was lost. He was the one who was calling not the righteous, but sinners to repentance. Well, fathers and brothers, moderator, our countries in some ways are very similar. All that I've said so far, I believe, applies in your context. But let me just give you a little insight into the difference in England. I don't think it's a difference that makes the context any more difficult. It's just a historic difference. And it gives you a little insight into our denomination, the English and Welsh Presbyterian Church. Here in Scotland, there are 1,500 congregations bearing the Presbyterian label across 8 denominations. In England, there are 34 across 2. But I want to suggest that there are 3 things that we can praise God for together. And I say these to encourage you. 34 congregations doesn't sound like much in the historic capital of the Westminster Standards. I got away with that. The last time I said that, a Scotsman corrected me. However, you get the point. Westminster is there in London. And in England in 1972, the last English Presbyterian church closed its doors. So when I say that there are 34 congregations, that actually represents significant progress in the decades since that time. And we can praise God as well that although there are just 2 denominations, mine, the EPCW, and the International Presbyterian Church, in God's grace, our denominations have been able to work together. We have a shared aim. We would like to put a Presbyterian church in every university city in the land. That doesn't sound like too much for us to aim for. So we praise God that together we love and respect one another, we preach in each other's churches, and we are working towards a shared goal. And then thirdly, a praise that in 2016, All Saints, which is the Presbyterian church in Newcastle that I attend, was able to open a seminary, Westminster Presbyterian Theological Seminary, simply because we recognized that our times called for pastors and teachers. Its first 4 alumni are now serving in EPQ churches, 1 on the continent, and 3 in England and Wales. Its current 8 students all realistically aspire to ministry, and 6 of them to the Presbyterian ministry, either in England or Wales or in continental Europe. And if I may ask for your prayers, fathers and brothers, please pray for the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. I would like to invite you. I have the privilege of leading that seminary now and have done for 2 years. We have an autumn conference. Some of you have been before, but I don't think many of you have been before. It's easy to remember the date. The year is 2022. The date is the 20th to the 22nd of October this year. And we have Alistair Begg, we have David Strain. I wish I could reel out more Scotsmen who are coming over from the States, but we've managed to secure those 2. And we have some other remarkable men who will be addressing us on the subject of Christ's mission for the church, very much picking up what was said from this platform earlier in the day, that Christ's mission for the church is to make disciples of all nations, baptizing them into the church of Christ to the glory of the triune God. Mr. Moderator, I want to thank you for the opportunity to say a few words. I've enjoyed being among you. Thank you for teaching me so much, and I want to leave with you then the greetings of EPQ. Thank you.
So much. Thank you. Thank you. Jonathan, it's been a joy having you. I got to meet you last week by coincidence, providence. I'm sure it was the Lord's providence as well. We got to spend some time together, but you are very welcome here. Thank you for bringing the greetings of EPQ, and please bring our greetings to your colleagues as well. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Moderator, it gives me great pleasure to welcome, or to ask you to welcome, Miss Elaine Duncan. As you know, Elaine is, I think, one of the most respected figures in Scottish church life as Secretary of the Bible Society, or CEO, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce her to you.
Thank you. Elaine, a very warm welcome once again. We've welcomed you before, and we welcome you again, and please now bring your address to the General Assembly.
Thank you, Moderator Ivor. I can't follow those lies, but that was lovely. Thank you so much. Great to be with you again, and I want to it's such a privilege to bring a report of our work and to such a receptive congregation. So thank you very much. And I really want to start with a big thank you. Many of you are personal supporters of our work at the Scottish Bible Society, but many of you are in congregations who are also supporting our work. So please take my thanks back to your congregations. We so appreciate your support. The fact you cheer us on, we appreciate your prayer, and we also appreciate your financial gifts to further the work of getting the Bible into people's hands. And then we pray that the Lord will speak into people's hearts. I want to tell you a little bit about what we're up to at the moment. First of all, we have been nudged by a number of people, including an MSP, to say, why can people who speak Gaelic not get hold of a full Bible in the Gaelic language? And I think the last full Bible that was produced was the 1992 version. We have done a modern Gaelic version of the New Testament, which we published about 3 years ago. And because we're now in the year of the 30th anniversary of the 1992 Gaelic Bible, then we are going to produce an anniversary edition that will be available later this year. And it will be, I can't remember how many we're ordering, but when we run out, it will be available for print on demand. And we trust that that will be a way to serve not just the Gaelic-speaking communities here in Scotland, but many of our Gaelic-speaking diaspora in places like America and Canada and other parts. The other exciting thing that we're doing for the Gaelic-speaking community is we're going to record the New Testament, the modern New Testament, in Gaelic over the next few months. And I'm looking for some help from some of you for this. Mary has already offered to assist at lunchtime. The advantage of sitting next to somebody who can twist their arm at lunch. But we're going to use local community Gaelic speakers. So we also need to use some actors. We're working in partnership with Faith Comes by Hearing, who are experts in making audio versions of the Bible in different languages. So we'll want to use some actors and actresses for some of the lengthy parts of the New Testament. But we'll also want to use people in the community. So those of you that have got Gaelic speakers in your congregations, please let them know about this. We'll be recording here in Edinburgh during July, and then we'll be in Lewis for the month of August. and looking for lots of varied voices to come and join with that. And we hope that that will be something that will serve mission purposes. I mean, many of us know that Gaelic medium schools are on the increase, and this is a way to get younger people actually interested not just in Gaelic but in the Bible, and we trust that the Lord will use it for His glory. One of the versions of John's Gospel that we've published just over the last few months is called Light and Life. It's a lovely illustrated magazine version of John's Gospel, and we do these kind of products because we know that for many people in our culture today, and Jonathan has just helpfully described something of our culture today, to actually give somebody a full Bible, and we're very committed to translating the full Bible, but to hand that to someone who hasn't read the Bible before is not always the most helpful thing. So Light and Life is a version of John's Gospel. I think if we click on a couple of slides, we'll see a picture of it there. And it's a magazine version, nicely illustrated. The chapters are marked, but not the verse numbers. So people are not interrupted in their reading by little numbers. We get used to that because we work with the Bible, we've had the Bible. But for people that are new to the Bible, then actually making it easy to read is serving people well. We're also going to be gathering some stories of light and life. These are the kind of things that can go out on social media and on our website. Again, just to interest people, intrigue them, get them into the Bible. And whenever I think about John's Gospel, whenever I'm reading it or speaking about it, I just remember so vividly a young student coming to me when I worked with UCCF, and she said, Elaine, I'm getting baptized at the weekend, and they've asked me to give my testimony, and I don't know what that means. So I said, well, just tell me how you became a follower of Jesus. And she said she was in her flat, she was going through a rough time, she was in that flat alone one evening, and there was a copy of John's Gospel. She lifted it up, she read it, and she said, I fell in love with Jesus. That's your testimony. just tell them that at your baptism. One of the appeals that we've done recently is for folk that we call them people in the persecuted church. They themselves refer to them as Christians under pressure. And it's very humbling when you hear people who we regard as seriously persecuted. They just see themselves as under pressure. And so we ran an appeal to support Bible work in Algeria and Morocco. In Algeria, they reckon that there are at least 2,000 people becoming Christians each year. And the Bible Society working there are determined that each one of them should get a Bible. It's not always easy to get the Bible into a place like Algeria, not least because quite often the shipment gets held up at customs and not allowed in. And so very often the prayer request is, look, could you pray that the Bibles that we have ordered will actually reach the people who need them. And then, if you just move on a couple of slides, please. Beyond Disaster is a book that is part of our wider program of Bible-based trauma healing. And I know that some of you and some of members of your congregations have been trained as facilitators in Bible-based trauma healing. And this is of a great help to many churches across Scotland. Beyond Disaster is the kind of spiritual first aid part of the trauma healing program. And we're just delighted that so many folk in Scotland are wanting to be trained in this quite gentle but very Bible-focused approach to help people deal with pain in their lives. And of course, in Scotland, that pain comes from all sorts of different directions for different reasons. But I'm glad to tell you that Beyond Disaster long before the 24th of February this year, had been translated into Ukrainian. I find this quite moving. Before the invasion, 400 facilitators were trained in Ukraine. And some of those facilitators are now able to run Bible-based trauma healing, both inside the country and then some that have left to be safe, but they're working amongst their fellow Ukrainians in refugee situations. The Lord's provision, that Bible Society there in Ukraine, they're all still safe and they're all still working. But they had the foresight. And yes, probably stimulated by the events in Crimea in 2014, but that they would focus on training people in this Bible-based trauma healing, and that work now is happening in Ukraine. Bible Society have also been working with children. We can just move on the slides, thanks. Working with children, many who are orphans, not because of the conflict, but prior to the conflict. There are lots of orphanages in Ukraine, and Bible Society staff have been taking suitable scripture portions to the children, just spending time with them, you know, singing and dancing and making sure they've got food and all this sort of thing. The Bible Society staff really have been absolutely amazing in the way that they have just felt the call of God to stay where they are and to keep doing what a Bible Society does. They're serving the church by providing scriptures and scripture portions and the Beyond Disaster booklet. The next slide just shows some of our staff in the Bible Society are also chaplains to the armed forces. And here they are with some other chaplains and just holding a communion service for the frontline troops. And immediately after this service, they were distributing Bibles to the soldiers who wanted them. And one soldier came up to Anatoly, who's the Deputy General Secretary in the Bible Society, and he said, I've never had time for God. I've never been interested in the Bible. But he said, I would like to take a Bible because I feel that now is the time to start my conversation with God. In another situation just by a park, Anatoly was there distributing humanitarian aid, and a woman came up to him and said, have you got any Bibles? And he said, of course. So he took her to his van, and he was reaching in to get a Bible for her. He turned round, and there was a queue behind this woman wanting Bibles. A gentleman stood with a loaf of bread in one hand and a Bible in the other. And he said to Anatoly, I know which is most important. So friends, these are just a few of our own activities as we partner with our Bible Society colleagues in Ukraine and in other places. But I think the stories from Algeria, Morocco, Ukraine, surely they inspire us, and they should motivate us to a greater courage and confidence as we take the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ to Scotland. Thank you, moderator.
Elaine, it's such a privilege having you. It's such a great way to break up the proceedings by being reminded of what God is doing in various parts of the world and in various ways, many of which are unknown to us, in secret. And you've brought some of these stories to us. There are many more. Some of these happening in the most, what we think are the most unlikely of places, where there is suffering that we have never experienced. I think it's such a salutary lesson for all of us, and it's so refreshing to have you tell us about the way we're delighted to have you, and we continue our support for the Bible Society, and we're thankful to God for the way in which the Bible Society works all over the world. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Moderator, it's again my great pleasure to introduce to you the Reverend Ian Wright. Ian is Minister of Covenant Church, which is in Orland Park, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago. Ian is a native of Edinburgh, and he represents the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. It's a denomination I know that you have a great affection and connection with. So may I introduce to you the Reverend Ian Wright.
Ian, welcome to the General Assembly of the Free Church of Scotland. Ian, it's a joy to have you. We met by, again, coincidence, providence. It was wonderful to meet you outside. We took the decision at the Ecumenical Relations Committee that we were not going to invite international delegates for the simple reason that we didn't want people to travel unnecessarily. But you, as it turns out, were going to be here anyway. So we happened to meet outside, and it's a real pleasure to be able to. We were supposed to have somebody from the FIEC. That's not possible, but we're equally happy to have yourself, and please address the Assembly. Thanks, Ian.
Thank you. Moderator, fathers and brethren, I treat it as a tremendous privilege to be allowed a few moments to address you, and I do not take that privilege lightly. Although I would have to say immediately that it is no particular hardship for me to return to my native land at intervals. I do have to say, though, I was deeply saddened, distressed even, to hear on the floor of this General Assembly that Edinburgh does not exist. I identify as coming from Edinburgh, and my contentment is that I do trust that a previous speaker's Twitter account will indeed be cancelled for hate speech by the time he gets home for his tea. I bring you the greetings, brethren, of your brothers and sisters in Christ in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. Is a bit of a mouthful and is often reduced to OPC, which in turn is reproduced as the only perfect church. It is not true. That is tongue-in-cheek, and I regret even mentioning it. You know, my humor in America just does not go across. You know, unless I finish with "that was a joke," they don't get it. The OPC's been around since 1936, at least in its present form. Of course, we would trace our history back to Pentecost and the pouring out of the Spirit of God, and before that to God's covenantal grace shown to Abraham. And dare I say that the desire of God to have fellowship with Adam and Eve before they were ejected from the garden. We are therefore part of one church. And I would bring you an update of what's happening in the OPC. Since 1936, when the OPC left the PCUSA, the Presbyterian Church of the United States of America, each year has seen a growth, with the exception perhaps of 2 or 3 years. Nothing that would be striking, and yet God's grace and mercy has been shown to us over the years, and we can say by His grace, and indeed by His grace alone, the OPC is larger than it was when it was formed in 1936. Just in round figures to help fix in your mind as to the relative size, we have approximately 30,000 members, we have 300 congregations, and we have 30 church plants. And the Lord continues to show His favor to us in the raising up of new congregations. In the presbytery, in which I have my membership, the presbytery grew to a size where it could no longer be sustained as a single presbytery and divided. Now, everything is big in Texas and almost as big in Wisconsin and Illinois. If I tell you that the presbytery before the division was something like 2.5 times the size of the United Kingdom, that will give you an idea of the scale. However, it wasn't the size that led to the division, it was the number of congregations which God had graciously blessed and strengthened us with. But it does mean that each of the two halves of the new presbyteries that were formed are both larger than the United Kingdom. That's not a matter of boasting, that's just a geographical fact. And it does bring with it certain difficulties in terms of bringing folk together for presbytery meetings. But by the grace of God, we have a wonderfully harmonious presbytery, and the Lord continues to lead us and guide us. And we pray that perhaps in God's providence, in the years that lie ahead, that there will be further congregations added to our number, and we might even divide down to a point where I might stand before you and tell you that presbytery is at last smaller than the United Kingdom. We faced some difficulties with the mission field. I hesitate even to name publicly a land in which we've had some missionary endeavors, but if I say it's in the Far East, you will understand that our missionaries there have been ejected, sent home. They seek to minister as best they can through whatever media are available to them, but it's not the same as boots on the ground. Our missionary in Haiti, if you follow the news with Haiti at all, you'll know that that has been in some degree of turmoil, and it's been making it very difficult for our missionary to be consistently in Haiti in order to assist with planting churches. So there are pressures that are moving against us. And we recognize that in this world we will always have the enemy of our soul seeking to undermine, pervert, or in some way discourage the work. And in that, no doubt each of you could also bear testimony that you know those factors yourself. If you do not know those factors, then you're not preaching the gospel. Allow me to use an illustration. It comes from over 100 years ago when Sir Edward Grey was the Foreign Secretary. And perhaps this story is known to you, that as he gazed out from the office of the Foreign Office, he remarked to John Spender, a friend of his, as he saw the lamps being lit on the 4th of August, 1914, that the lamps were going out all over Europe, and that he doubted that he would see them relit in his lifetime. Brethren, as we consider the condition of the land in which God has placed us, whether it is here in my native land of Scotland or in America, to which God in his sometimes perplexing providences has called me, we face much the same struggles and difficulties. And it may be that as God would bring to your remembrance this brief occasion on which I have been granted the privilege of speaking to you, that the OPC would come into your mind and that you would give thanks for its witness now for almost 100 years since its division from the PCUSA. But I would venture to suppose that though we may indeed give thanks for one another's ministries and such tokens of God's goodness as we see the blessing of God in raising up new congregations, whether it's here in Scotland or in the United States of America, there are those matters which are closer to hand and which cause us great distress, even as we reflect upon them. And I would have you, even as you pray for the land of Scotland and the pressures which you are facing, and the things that you are even at this General Assembly discussing, and even across the street in the other General Assembly, in ways in which are far from satisfactory, that as you pray for these matters, that you would recognize that these are pressures that are common to God's people in many another land. And though we may be separated by thousands of miles and an entire ocean between us, yet we can stand at one another's elbows before the throne of grace. I began by speaking in terms of identifying as someone who comes from Edinburgh. That is my boast. That was funny. No, it wasn't. Have you all turned American the last few? It's my boast to say that I come from Edinburgh. But other people are talking about identifying with all sorts of different things. I remember in 1 Thessalonians how Paul talks about how God will send a strong deception. And I wondered when I was a young man what that would look like. I think we have examples of it in our generation now in a way which would have been inconceivable when I was a young man. That someone should wake up in the morning as a man, but by the time he goes to bed, declare himself to be a woman. And if that didn't elicit from us our care and concern that somebody should be so confused, what is even more perplexing is that the world will join in and celebrate with him this utter foolishness. And if you should dare to venture an opinion that the person needs help rather than affirmation, then you will be accused of all manner of hate speech. Such is the strong delusion which we face in our generation. The days, I believe, are growing darker. But when the days are darker, the light shines ever more brightly. And it would be our desire from the other side of the Atlantic to assure you not only of our prayers and indeed our affections in the Lord, but that our heartfelt desire and prayer is that you would shine ever more brightly in a wicked and depraved generation. May God grant you grace to hold ever higher and ever brighter the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ. And to his name, and to his name alone, be the glory and the praise. Moderator, I appreciate very much the opportunity to address you and do indeed bring you the greetings of the OPC.
Ian, thank you so much for coming amongst us. Thank you for your short time of fellowship. I wish it was longer, maybe at some future date. I know that the Ecumenical Relations Committee have decided, in principle anyway, to send our clerk to the next year's OPC General Assembly, and he will enjoy that very much indeed, and you will enjoy his company tremendously. And so it's at least 5 years since one of us have been there. We do value tremendously our sister church relationships, even though we're not always able to act upon these by way of sending people. And of course, the last couple of years have been particularly difficult. But my own affection for the OPC goes back many, many decades. To when we worshipped, my boss said to me once, this was in a past life as an engineer, my boss came to me and said, we're going to have to send you to California for 6 months. You're going to have to go to California. So, well, when somebody says you have to go, you have to go. But it was
Did he send you with a tent?
We spent 6 really happy months in California. We worshipped in an OPC congregation. We got to know loads of people, so that's where it all began. And so my affection for the OPC has continued ever since. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you. Okay, then we have until 5 o'clock. Are you able to conclude your presentation by then? Okay, that's fine.
If we could go back to the slide that we were on, that would be helpful. The one, probably the second half. Yeah, thanks very much. So we were talking about this kind of triage process in order to involve that you don't go down this massive route of an investigation when it's not necessary. One thing I forgot to mention, which was perhaps a statement on what we are like at the moment in the church, is part of the triage process would involve a kind of referral to the Board of Ministry to make sure that pastoral care is being provided and the advisors on church procedure are being provided to people who are accused. Pastoral care is to everyone involved in a case. We are often very bad at the moment of just leaving someone alone when they're facing some of these difficult issues. They have no knowledge on church law and procedure, and there's very little pastoral care. But that can't be done by the same people who are doing discipline. So it would just be a simple matter of making sure someone, the Board of Ministry, who I think we heard have been doing work on pastoral care in Andrew's presentation, would take over some of that responsibility in a case, just to make sure it is actually actively being provided and that proper support is given to everyone involved in the discipline process. We've often forgotten it in the past. I forgot it earlier on. We need to get this right. So where I got to was there's been a triage situation. We've decided this is a conduct issue, a behavioural issue, and I want to use this as the way of illustrating how the rest of the procedure works so that we can understand it at broad terms. The triage group would know the nature of the complaint, they'd know the type of experience that's required, and they'd appoint an investigation group. That would be led by either the chair or the vice chair of the Conduct and Complaints Committee, but it would have the right people on it for the issue at hand. Every case is different and you need to have the right experience. They would investigate, keep records, interview witnesses properly, and prepare a report on the matter. A copy of that would go to the respondent, the person accused, for them to confirm if they are accepting the allegations or if they're denying it, for them to give their written response. If they accept the recommendation and accept that that whatever has happened, it goes back to the presbytery at that point with the report, with their response. The people appear at presbytery and presbytery decides on an outcome, a sanction. Sometimes that could be an admonition, sometimes that could just be a rebuke and we move on. Sometimes it will be more serious. So that's where they accept. Where they deny, the hearing would be conducted before the presbytery. The paragraph that James mentioned was missing was meant to say quite clearly that training would need to be given to the presbytery before the hearing, and the principal clerk would be responsible for that training. A female advisor would be appointed to the presbytery to help them and make sure we do things as best we can. But the hearing takes place before the presbytery sitting as judge. Probably only a few members, I think 3 members of presbytery would be designated to ask questions so that everyone isn't jumping in with questions, but the decision is a decision of the church courts of our presbyteries. I mentioned earlier there's stuff to do with vulnerable witnesses, interviewing women, all these kind of things exist at the moment, but we need to actually implement them, and having a proper investigation group who know these processes would be helpful. We're a Presbyterian system, and so at the end of a presbytery decision, there could be an appeal in certain cases. What we want to make sure, though, is what doesn't happen is what sometimes can happen at the moment, which is that any decision can be appealed. And so midway through a case, you can suddenly appeal a little decision in order to delay matters, and a case drag on for years, waiting for commissions and assemblies to rule, go back to the presbytery, come back again, and none of that should happen. So we would make clear that the principle of having an appeal is Presbyterianism, or having a dissenting complaint from the members of the court, but that should be limited to the end of the proceedings before the presbytery, at whatever point that ends. So you're not going to have many appeals throughout the process. You conclude the matter and you have an appeal in order to stop undue delay. I know there is an amendment coming to essentially scrap the PMG and appoint a new disciplinary process group. I hope I've made clear to the Assembly some of the extensive process consultations the PMG have already been involved in and undertaking to get to the point that we're at. I believe introducing a new group at this stage would be hugely detrimental to the process, I believe would result in the loss of extensive knowledge the PMG has in relation to discipline. Written documents often don't reflect the hours of thinking that's gone into this.
I'm going to have to interrupt you. With all due respect, we're not dealing with that right now. We're only dealing with your presentation of this, and particularly as you're not a member of Assembly, I really
That's fine.
must...
That's fine. In which case, I would take any questions on the process, because it is an important process and we want people to understand it.
Okay. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you so much. Thank you. And we do appreciate the work that has already gone into this. Do we have questions on this? Yes, Martin Walker, please.
The first time I came across all of this, sorry, moderator, fathers and brethren, the first time I came across all of this was when I was reading my assembly papers. And I have to say I was having to play catch-up all the time. Thank you for the presentation just now. I understand things much better. I just want to focus on something about the principle here. Once you get to a stage where the process has been concluded and an appeal is possible, can I ask, who does the appeal go, who will hear the appeal? Will it be the Superior Court or the Presbytery itself?
So in accordance with the Presbyterian system, now with the abolition of synods, the Commission has been empowered to take up appeals, so it could be the Commission of the Assembly or the Assembly, but it's the Superior Court that hears an appeal.
What I would then ask is that an appeal, if we're applying the rules of natural justice, should be heard by people who've had nothing to do with the process up to that point. And with the way our Presbyterian system works, you could have people who've been sitting on Presbytery who are on the Commission of Assembly. How will they be removed so that the process is fair in terms of natural justice?
So in terms of our current system, if there's an appeal, the members of that presbytery become parties at the bar of the Assembly or the Commission, and they are not part of making the decision.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you. Other questions? Angus McRae.
Thank you very much, Moderator. I was very grateful for the way you explained things, and it helped me to understand much more clearly. My questions relate to how the flow chart fits in with some other areas of concern about conduct or discipline. So how does it fit in with safeguarding? And has your group sort of taken soundings from those who are responsible for safeguarding? That would be one question. And the other has to do with matters that might not only come before the church, but that might be referred to civil or criminal processes. And my question there would be, where does this fit there? Should things be sisted, or should the church get on with these things when there's more than one authority looking into a serious matter? Thank you.
Thank you, Angus. Those are both very important questions. Safeguarding has been considered and worked into the process. At the moment, it's one of the failings of our discipline system that safeguarding is completely separate from our discipline system. The idea, though, of having the central committee to which everything goes to means that referrals to safeguarding can be made by the committee immediately, as is our obligation to immediately refer to safeguarding. So that is built into a more extensive flow chart than what is before us, because this is trying to just give us a summary version. Hopefully that answers the safeguarding question. In relation to other jurisdictions, the criminal jurisdiction, this is obviously a complicated issue. At the moment, it's made very clear that the church courts are referring to a different matter than the criminal courts. They have a slightly different focus, different things, but sometimes they deal with the same thing. And there are occasions where for the church to wade into the process would prejudice criminal procedures. There are other occasions where, regardless of the outcome of the criminal procedures, what is being accepted happened by the church courts, the church can deal with and proceed with discipline. So it has to be a case-by-case basis by those involved in this group who have experienced policies, etc., to make those decisions about when it is appropriate to wait for a criminal process to conclude first and when the church can act first. So there's overlap, but they're not completely overlapping, which is where the issue can arise.
Other questions? Ian Watson.
Moderator. Stephen, thank you for your presentation. In that presentation, you made a great big deal about consulting widely.
Mm-hmm.
So, in the light of that the PMG is going to consult widely, is it still your intention to bring an interim act to the October Commission of Assembly? And if it is still your intention to do that, what help are you going to give those of us who are presbytery clerks to enable us to prepare the presbytery in advance for the consultation process? Because if it's going to go to the Commission of Assembly and then under the Barrier Act, we only have until the end of December to make a decision, and that does feel rather rushed.
So my understanding is that saying that something goes to the Commission of Assembly, the Commission is empowered to take up the matter, and the Commission was empowered last year to take up the matter and didn't. So if it's not ready, if there's not a good time scale by the October Commission, then it wouldn't go to the October Commission. It might go to a later commission. It may come back next year. If commissioners at the Assembly were not convinced, if those at the Commission of the Assembly were not convinced there was sufficient time to consider it, it might come back to the Assembly, because the Commission can also refer things back to say it's better for the Assembly to take it up. In terms of the consultation, there would be a consultation process with explanatory documents, etc. And of course, presbytery clerks would be welcome to ask us any questions, discuss it with us if they had concerns about the consultation. I would hope that we would actually conduct the consultation like we did with the questions and formula, where we came to your presbytery, answered questions, took soundings. And so I would have hoped that presbyteries might welcome us to come along and talk to them about it for the consultation. That may happen online, or that may happen in person, depending on circumstances for timings, but we'd see what people want to do. And we're not fixed rigidly through a process, I think, as well.
Well, that's good to hear. Supplementary, perhaps, moderator, then. In the light of what you've just said then, Stephen, are you still presenting to the Assembly the two deliverances that are in the papers?
It's not for me to... I'm not a commissioner. I can't make any comment on that.
You can perhaps ask that question later on.
That's for the convener.
Well, the convener, would the convener answer that question, please?
Can you repeat the question, please? Well, just in the light of what Stephen has said about widely consulting, and also the uncertainty as to whether anything will be ready by October, are you still bringing those deliverances under B to the Assembly today?
Yes.
Okay.
George Coggle, please.
Thank you for a very thorough presentation and explanation. But perhaps this is a silly question, but
no silly question.
Given what you said about the deficiencies in presbyteries acting as investigators, the CCC that you've got down is comprised of ministers and elders. So two parts to the question. Given that the General Assembly is just a broader presbytery, what confidence do you have that this will necessarily be a better investigating entity?
Yep.
And the supplementary question is, you say that they will be suitably qualified ministers and elders. I think that needs to be unpacked a bit further, and how will you guarantee that that is the case?
Yep. So the CCC, although mainly being ministers and elders, and the investigation groups would have to have female advisors, would have to have perhaps other advisors depending on the nature of the case. Let's say there was a complicated financial crime. We might need a financial advisor to come in and give detailed information to the CCC. So it's not limited to just those ministers and elders, although it is led by the appropriate committee who has been appointed by the Assembly, the chair, the vice chair of the investigation. They investigate because they're the people that the Assembly's appointed and have that authority to chair it. In terms of the appropriate people being on the CCC, I think that was the right number, C's, it's the same kind of, I suppose, nominations process, which I know the clerks are revising or looking at, but typically job descriptions are issued for our boards and committees now, where we give detailed information about what we're looking for. The Board of Trustees mentioned that they try to balance different things. They want different types of people with different skills. There are a variety of skills that could be helpful. There are ministers and elders who have legal experience, police experience, other HR experience, investigatory experience from their own professional lives, and we would draw on that from across the wider church. The issue at the moment is that any one presbytery might not have the relevant people to investigate, and so they might just give it to 3 ministers who have no experience of investigating. So it's saying that the committee would have the right job experience, but the appointments to the committee would be for the Assembly. So.
Can I just follow up? Because something you said there, which was in my mind, when you said the presbyteries might not have. I'm presuming then that the CCC, as appointed, would make sure that the investigators for any given case would not include people from the presbytery.
Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons for having chair or vice chair coming from different presbyteries, etc.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Other questions? Brian Morton.
Moderator, fathers and brethren, just a couple of questions that have come out of points that you've raised. Thank you for your presentation, Stephen. And then I have a question that had already formulated from my reading of the report.
Yeah.
You mentioned about experts being involved and wide consultation, and I wondered, work I'm involved in often has experts by experience. Did the PMG, I think that's the right, is that an acronym? I can't remember. Anyway, that's the right initials. Did the PMG engage with people who've been through the disciplinary process, perhaps over the last 10 years for the sort of the newer process, and maybe those who'd been in the previous process?
Very few have gone through a full disciplinary process. We did engage with certain people within the church who had been heavily involved in the procedure of previous discipline processes. I don't think it would be appropriate to necessarily mention who those individuals were, given some of the cases would then be getting discussed. But there are various people who have a lot of experience, like many years' experience as ministers, who have been involved in pursuing cases or defending cases at different times in the church history, and some of them were asked for views. Some people, obviously, we have named previously, like the likes of James McKeever, a previous clerk, was shown some material, and there would be more those kind of things. But yeah, so I don't think we have specifically gone to anyone who's been through a disciplinary process, because there hasn't been full process, and anyone who's been, I suppose, disciplined is often left, gone, probably doesn't want to speak to someone from the Free Church, but definitely people who've been involved in using the procedure.
And there was a point just for clarification, because as you went through it, it struck me there was, in relation to the triage level, and I think the previous questioner asked about the potential for conflict of interest, was thought given to the involvement of somebody, presbytery clerk or Kirk session clerk, at that triage stage, who actually, by my reading the rest of it, may actually be involved in the rest of the process. Was that considered as a potential conflict of interest?
Yes. So I guess the thought is that, like, clerks are often the people who get the complaint, receive complaints, etc. So they have to know about them, and some local knowledge is necessary. Presbytery clerks don't make decisions at presbytery, they're there to advise presbytery. Now, part of the solution to that conflict of interest process was when we talked about the training for a hearing in that paragraph that was missing, unfortunately, there was also reference to the idea that there might be an independent procedural advisor appointed by the principal clerk to help the presbytery. If there was such a, that would always be done, but that might help alleviate a procedural bias or a conflict like that. But I guess that I think there is a need for some local knowledge often in triage, and they will probably already have heard of the complaint. So bringing them into the process means you're not just triaging from people far away who don't know anything about the local situation.
Okay, thank you. And the question that I had wanted to ask, that was just the clarification that came up, so apologies for that. Apologies, moderator and brethren. I wondered what assessment the PMG had made and what conclusions they'd reached in relation to the principle, because this is what we're dealing with today, is the principles, is the principle about the importance of the rights in the interest of natural justice, the rights of the person facing potential disciplinary or capability action, including access to things such as support, which going beyond pastoral support, I noted that in the document, such things as advice, guidance, representation, access to the reports, and access to the outcomes. And I think I maybe missed it because you might have mentioned some of it in your presentation, but I wondered if you could point us to that in the report, because obviously we're endorsing the principles. And I wanted to ask about that. Thank you.
So if you go to 3.4, paragraph 3.4, currently little support is given to someone facing a complaint. The revision envisions that a procedural advisor will be appointed to the respondent and that the responsibility for ensuring pastoral support to all parties involved in a case will lie with the Board of Ministry. So that procedural advisor is something that's not routinely done currently, and as you say, is an issue of natural justice. I think often the church centrally might take detailed advice, and they have no advice. So you're absolutely right, we need to balance such interests.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. We're almost at 5 o'clock. Do I have one more question? Okay. Yes, Gordon, please. We'll make this the last question, and then I'll explain what we've decided to do with this matter.
Moderator, thanks for the opportunity to ask a question. You say that the process ties in with the safeguarding. The advice that's given at safeguarding training recommends that if anyone has got any doubt about whether they should report a matter, that they confer with 31.8, which is a body that provides 24/7 availability. How does that fit in with the process that's here in terms of the training that's currently been delivered within the church?
So I suppose there are, sorry, 31.8, are you referring to the person making the complaint originally, or are you referring to those who receive a complaint in the church?
If somebody receives a complaint as a safeguarding coordinator, and they have a question as to whether they should refer this to an outside agency, because there may be a criminal element within it, the advice that is currently given is that they contact 31.8, not going through the process that's here. And it's just to make sure that our processes are tied in, and that while we're delivering training within the church, that we're actually advising people that fits with the process that one the church is signed up to, but also we're signed up to taking the advice from 31.8.
Yeah, absolutely. So with many of these things, complaints can go to different people and be handled in different ways. The vision in a lot of this is that every complaint must be reported to the committee so they know about it. Obviously, if an individual safeguarding coordinator takes the advice and feels it needs to be reported, they would report it. But there's another check put in place at the kind of this committee triage stage, where if it's not been reported, they might say, well, actually, we think this is something we either need to take further advice from 31.8 or report through the safeguarding channels. So the detail has not been written about how that will operate, but the intention is that it's very clear safeguarding is never missed. It's got to be, so we don't want someone at a local level to make a decision to ignore safeguarding. They should still be referring the complaints issue, and then at a later stage they might say, actually, we should report for safeguarding as soon as they receive it, because they have a bit more experience, but they also will probably draw on 31.8 as a good resource. But the exact detail of how that's going to work hasn't been written yet, and I'm sure we would want to consult with you and get some impact on that.
Okay, thanks so much. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, now at this point, what we have decided in consultation with the clerks and those who are presenting this is that we will return to this tomorrow morning. And the reason is that this is a major report, a major discussion that requires a lot of reflection. We do not want to be rushed into anything. Tonight you're going to have another major report, and the last thing we want to do is to push that into the wee small hours. So there's plenty of slack tomorrow morning. So if that is okay with you, and even if it's not, well, we'll still return to it tomorrow. We'll return to it tomorrow when we're all fresh and ready to begin the day. We want at this stage for the report, for the supplementary report to be moved and seconded, and that will draw a line for today. James.
Moderator, I would like to move the report as set out in the deliverance on page 70.
It's going to be seconded by the clerk.
Thank you, Moderator. I just want to say two things in seconding the report. First of all, simply to give thanks to James Fraser and to Stephen, especially Stephen, for his presentation of some of the structure and the work that the PMG is engaged in, and also to give thanks for the focus on consultation. I think the questions and formula process has confirmed that consultation works, because we have achieved what we set out to do, and the Church is satisfied with that. And just to reaffirm our commitment to further consultation in the exercise in which we are engaged. And with these two comments, I am pleased to second the report.
Thank you very much. And of course, if you have further questions during the evening, then I'm quite sure that you can approach Stephen or James, and that might be a tidy way and convenient way to do it. So we'll come back to it tomorrow morning. I think the clerk is going to make some notices and...
Thank you, Moderator. First of all, if I may, Sharon Fraser was presented with a bouquet of flowers this afternoon. She wants to convey thanks to the General Assembly, so if you allow me to read her comments. I'm not one for public speaking, but I would like to express my sincere thanks to yourself and to the General Assembly, as well as my colleagues in the offices and ETS. It has been a genuine pleasure, privilege and honour to work with the Free Church over the past 20 years, and I'm so grateful to have worked with and met so many lovely people over the years. My many colleagues in the offices have changed over the years, and I've enjoyed working with every one of them. Just for the Assembly to record her thanks. And we do have the Board of Ministry report coming after, when we come back for our next session, and this is the last call for amendments and addenda to that report. At this stage, we have no amendments and no addenda, and this is your last opportunity to do that. So General Assembly now adjourned to meet in this hall at 6:30 p.m. this evening, of which public intimation is now made.
And now may the grace of our Lord and Saviour Jesus Christ, the love of God the Father, and the communion and fellowship of the Holy Spirit rest on and abide with each one of us, both now and always. Amen.